Again, this is the second video for Monday, December the 13th. The topic of this video is there are two paths, one to joy, the other to ruin. And we're going to notice in Ecclesiastes chapter 10 a continuing illustration of that thought. Now, Ecclesiastes chapter 10 and verse 1 draws upon an analogy that is foreign to our day. However, by keeping the verse in context, we can understand its truth. Now, recalling the original manuscript of the Scriptures would not have had verses nor chapter breaks, let us consider Ecclesiastes chapter 10 and verse 1 by drawing upon the previous verse. Ecclesiastes chapter 9 and verse 18, the last verse of that chapter, we read, "Wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one sinner destroyeth much good." Now, knowing the immediate context was a reference to one sinner who is able to destroy much good, we read in Ecclesiastes 10 and verse 1, "Dead flies cause the ointment, the perfume, the oil of the apothecary," that is a vessel that contains perfume or oil. Dead flies cause the ointment of the apothecary to send forth a stinking savor, a stinking smell. And so doth a little folly, a little sin, a little silliness, a little foolishness, him that is in reputation for wisdom and honor. Now here's in context with the verse prior to Ecclesiastes verse 1. I suggest that the dead flies are really to be little sins, at least from a human perspective. In the same way that dead flies pollute the expensive perfume and cause it to become rotten and putrid, little sins, a little folly, can discredit a wise man and ruin his reputation. Now, we don't have time to cover all that we would like to in Ecclesiastes 10, and so I'm going to draw your attention to verses 12 through 15. And there we have the influence and the character of one's counselors. Ecclesiastes 10, verses 12 through 15, states a contrast between the words and the counsel of wise men and the counsel of fools. Now, the counsel of a wise man is described as gracious in verse 12, meaning that the words of a wise man are to be looked upon by favor or with favor. However, verse 12 again, the lips of a fool will swallow up himself, and by the way, anyone else is foolish enough to heed his counsel. Now, Solomon continues in verse 13 with admonitions regarding a fool's counsel, and he states, the beginning of the words of the fool, the words being the counsel of the fool's mouth is foolishness, and at the end of his talk is mischievous madness. And so, here's the thought. From the outset, the words of a fool express what is in his heart. He is a fool, therefore he is foolish. And where does the counsel and the words of a fool lead? In the words of Solomon, mischievous madness, otherwise sheer insanity. You know, we live in a world in which there are men and women who are utter fools in places of influence. It is true in government, it is true in corporations, it's true in institutions, and yes, it's even true in churches. And the counsel of a fool inevitably leads to sheer madness. Why? Because they've rejected the truth. Now, while wise men tend to be men of few words, the fool is full of words. And by the way, he's wise in his own eyes. I sometimes ask people as I'm teaching, what can you teach a fool? And of course the answer is, according to verse 15, nothing. Absolutely nothing. Now, another sad trait of a fool is he not only refuses wise counsel, but he lacks the competence to find his own way to go to the city. In other words, he is incapable of following simple directions. And then finally, verse 16, defining the moral character of a leader as a child. That is a king who has the maturity, the ignorance, the foolishness, the silliness of a child. Solomon observes in verse 16, Woe to thee, O land, O nation, O country, O people. Woe to thee when thy king, when your leader is a child. And I'm not talking about chronological age here, but one that is unwise, inexperienced, or lacks discernment. Woe to a nation, woe to a people, woe to a church, woe to a school, woe to a corporation when thy leader is inexperienced, unwise, lacks discernment. And by the way, in your princes, your leadership eats in the morning. The reference there is one given to self-indulgence. Now here's the closing thought, the application. Today's society is often guilty of promoting incompetency over qualification. Rather than promote persons based upon their skill or their moral character and merit, governments, corporations, educational institutions, and yes, even churches fail to choose leaders whose lives are a testimony to wisdom, self-discipline, and hard work. Failing to seek the candidates with moral character, self-discipline, and proven success leads to the downfall of any institution, government, or nations. And so then we say in verse 16, woe to the nation, the corporation, or ministry that prefers failure, immaturity, inexperience, and self-indulgence over godly wisdom and unwavering convictions. I have watched this in our churches and in our schools, that for some reason in the last generation, we take men who have been failures in other institutions and in other churches, and we promote them to places of authority and influence. And we have suffered because of it. The same is true in government. Woe to the nation that promotes incompetency. Woe to the people that accept it. Thank you for joining me today. Go out into this world today and live a competent, moral, influential life. Be the light, be the salt God has called us to be. Bye-bye.